They were trusted by their governments and betrayed them for power, ideology, or money. From the CIA to MI6, these double agents didn't just leak secrets, they changed the course of history. This is the dark world of Cold War espionage.
The last time I spoke to a communist, knowing that he was a communist, was sometime in 1934.
This is the moment that Kim Philby told the biggest lie of his life. During this 1955 press conference, the former intelligence officer expressed his loyalty to Britain, its people, and to his former employer, MI5. His true loyalty, however, lay elsewhere.
He was one of the worst traitors in history.
In this video, we will discuss the life and death of one of the Soviet Union's most valuable spies, a tale of betrayal, espionage, romance, and death. This is the story of Kim Philby.
This is a very, very dirty story, but after all, our work does imply getting dirty hands from time to time.
Harold Adrian Russell. Philby was born into a wealthy family in British India in 1912. He received a first-rate education and was accepted into Cambridge as a young man. By that point, he was referred to by his nickname of Kim, and had been living a relatively standard life for a man born into his lifestyle and privilege. However, while studying at university, Philby became different to many of the young men he had grown up with. At the time, new radical political ideologies were spreading across Europe, with the Soviet Union becoming communist in 1917, and the rise of fascist parties in Germany, Spain, and Italy. Passionate about politics and the plight of working-class people, Philby found himself leaning towards the political left.
And he fought for communism all his life, since Cambridge.
After university, Philby moved to Vienna to assist German refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. It was here that he met Litzi Friedman, a young Austrian communist of a Hungarian Jewish background. The couple fell in love shortly after and started a relationship. Despite having little money and living in a tiny apartment, the couple worked hard to protect the working class against the rise of fascism. They were married in 1934, 2 months before the couple fled Austria for the UK. It was after their return that Kim met a man called Arnold Deutsch, a recruiter for the Soviet intelligence services. During the meeting, Philby was surprised when his new contact told him not to join the party, and discouraged him from carrying out any further communist activities. Instead, he advised Philby to infiltrate British intelligence and become a spy for the Soviet Union. It was at this moment that Philby decided to dedicate his life to communism. He sacrificed everything for the cause, including his marriage. Over the next few years, Philby worked his way into British intelligence. Starting as a journalist in 1937, he used his position to build connections in MI5 and MI6. He broke off his marriage with Litzi officially in 1940, although they remained friends for many years after. During his time as a journalist, Philby went to Spain where he covered the Civil War. It was here that he began to pass the first pieces of information to both the British and Soviet governments. Philby returned to London in 1939, continuing to work as a journalist. By 1941 time, Philby's good work in Spain had earned him a position at MI6, working on counterintelligence. Throughout the war, Philby passed invaluable secrets and information to the Soviet Union. He even provided Stalin with an advanced warning of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and the Japanese's intention to invade Southeast Asia. The quality of some of Philby's intelligence seemed so unbelievably useful that many Soviet officials struggled to believe it at first. But as time went on, they started to realize that Philby was potentially their greatest asset. His incredible ability to steal documents and carry out espionage shocked the Soviets. He reportedly made friends with the archivist at MI6, allowing him to take secret documents home without fuss.
Every evening I left the office with a big briefcase full of reports which I had written myself, full of files taken out of the actual documents, out of the actual archives. I used to hand them to my Soviet contact in the evening. Next morning I'd get the file back, the contents having been photographed, and take them back early in the morning and put the files back in their place.
He seemed to have an exceptional ability to act confidently and calmly while in positions of great risk. Whether it was his upper-class background, his charm, or his acting skills, something allowed Philby to spy on the British for years without ever arousing suspicion. Philby became part of a group that later became known as the Cambridge Five, a spy ring that was active throughout the war and into the 1950s. Philby and 4 other students from Cambridge University arguably became the Soviet Union's most valuable source of Allied intelligence during this time, supplying them with over 15,000 classified documents. In 1944, the Soviets helped Philby maneuver his way to the top of the system to successfully replace his boss as head of Section 9, the department responsible for anti-communist efforts. The anti-Soviet section of British intelligence was now in the hands of a Soviet agent. Alongside his work as a Soviet spy, Philby also found time for romance. He was remarried in 1946 to Aileen Furse, a British shop worker. The couple had 5 children together from 1941 to 1950, during a time when Philby's responsibilities at MI6 had grown substantially. Everything was going well, until finally, disaster struck.
The Foreign Secretary made his expected statement in Parliament today about the disappearance of the 2 Foreign Office officials, Mr. Maclean and Mr. Burgess.
In the summer of 1951, 2 members of the Cambridge Five suddenly disappeared. Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess were recruited as Soviet spies while studying at Cambridge in the 1930s, having both disagreed with the idea of capitalism. Like Philby, the 2 men had been passing valuable documents to the Soviets for years, using their positions working at the Foreign Office and the BBC. Things went wrong for the 2 agents, however, when British and American codebreakers managed to infiltrate Soviet messages detailing a meeting between a KGB agent and one of their double agents. The message also said that the double agent would soon be visiting his pregnant wife in New York. Now stationed in Washington, Kim Philby saw the decoded messages and instantly knew he had a serious problem. The double agent in the message was Donald Maclean, one of the Cambridge Five. With this information, it wouldn't be long until MI6 or the CIA would arrest Maclean and potentially the entire ring of spies. Philby had to act and sent fellow ring member Guy Burgess to warn him. In a desperate attempt to avoid arrest, Maclean and Burgess flew to Moscow and defected, confirming both of their positions as Soviet double agents. The disappearance of the 2 agents immediately cast suspicion upon Philby because of his close association with Burgess. He was questioned extensively about his involvement and was eventually forced to resign from his position. But this was almost the best-case scenario for Philby. He was incredibly lucky to have convinced British intelligence that he was innocent. If they had found out the truth, he wouldn't have just been out of work. He would have spent the rest of his life in prison. Philby had become an exceptional liar, and his calm and collected British persona helped keep him hidden. It is unlikely that even Philby's wife, Aileen, knew about his allegiance to the Soviet Union.
I really don't know. I think she probably suspected he'd been accused. I mean, you know, Burgess had been living with us. It must be very difficult not to know, although he was very, very good. He obviously was excellent because he got away with all the questioning by all the sort of authorities and came out of it.
In October 1955, a Labour MP asked Prime Minister Anthony Eden if he had attempted to cover up Philby's position as a communist spy. After all, it would be very embarrassing for the British government to admit it had allowed a traitor to rise so high in MI6. The accusations caused an uproar, and the MP was forced to retract his comment. Philby was officially cleared of any wrongdoing by Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan in November.
The Foreign Secretary said there was no evidence that you were the so-called third man who allegedly tipped off Burgess and Maclean. Are you satisfied with that clearance that he gave you?
Yes, I am.
Well, if there was a third man, were you in fact the third man?
No, I was not.
Despite remaining free, Philby was forced to return to work as a journalist. In 1956, he was sent to Beirut to work as a Middle East correspondent for The Observer and The Economist. His wife died a year later after years of poor health. Philby had been having an affair with Eleanor Brewer, and the couple married in 1959. Alongside his journalism work across the Middle East, Philby continued to spy for MI6, although less officially than before. Many in both British and American intelligence services never trusted him again after the scandal of 1951. While in Beirut, Philby's already heavy drinking became even more excessive and affected his work and personal life. The CIA allegedly had contacts in the Middle East, keeping an eye on Philby while he drank himself to death. Despite heavy suspicions, Philby continued to supply the KGB with information while in the Middle East. By the early 60s, his drinking had taken over his life. It is unclear what caused his decline while abroad. Was it the pressure of decades of spying? Guilt? The loss of his wife? It's hard to say. But one thing's for sure, Philby's dedication to communism was just enough to keep him going. Although it hadn't been proven 10 years before, many across Britain still believed he was guilty. Some have even suggested that MI6 knew the whole time, but tried to cover it up to avoid embarrassment. However, in 1961, Philby's spying career finally came to an end. A Soviet spy named Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the West, bringing with him a list of names. The list revealed many of those who were secretly working for the USSR. Many were unsurprised when they saw that one of the names was that of Kim Philby. Their suspicions finally confirmed, MI6 sent Nicholas Elliott, a former friend and colleague of Philby, to Beirut. His task was to confront his friend and return home with a written confession. When Philby opened up his door and saw Elliott, his response was reportedly, "I rather thought it would be you." The two former friends had a lengthy conversation, during which Philby confessed to Elliott about his years of betrayal. He refused to sign a written confession, however, and fled to Moscow before MI6 could get their hands on him. MI6 were heavily criticized for letting yet another Soviet spy escape. Elliott, however, insisted there was nothing he could have done to prevent it. By 1963, Philby had been granted Soviet citizenship and was living in Moscow. His wife Eleanor relocated in 1964, joining him in Russia. During their time apart, Philby had begun an affair with the wife of his former partner in Espionage, Donald Maclean. Eleanor stayed for only a year before divorcing Philby and returning home. The affair also didn't last, and once again Kim was alone. Back home in the UK, Philby's years of treachery left a mark on British intelligence. Not only was it incredibly embarrassing for them, but also sparked a wave of paranoia and distrust.
It infected the whole British intelligence establishment with the paranoia. I mean, if Philby, good old Kim, could have been a spy, any of us could have been.
Philby would later go on to give speeches in several communist nations, explaining how he was able to avoid discovery for so long.
Furthermore, because I'd been born into the British governing class, because I knew a lot of people of influential standing, I knew that they would never get too tough with me. They'd never try to beat me up or knock me around.
Despite Philby living in an officially communist nation like he'd always wanted, the reality of life in Soviet Russia was not how Philby imagined. Far from the hero's welcome he expected, he was kept under constant surveillance by the KGB. He wasn't allowed to meet foreigners. He was banned from the KGB headquarters and given poor jobs by Soviet intelligence, who still couldn't trust him. There was also a risk of retaliation from the British, and Philby's life was heavily controlled by the KGB. Beside the issues in his personal life, Philby also had issues with the state of Soviet communism, believing that while the ideals were right, the people in charge were very wrong.
He saw that the life here was not a paradise at all. He saw the secretiveness of life. He saw the power of the KGB. He saw the absence of the freedom.
Philby remained a depressed alcoholic while living in Moscow and even attempted suicide in the late 60s. Things seemed to improve slightly later on, and he married his fourth wife, Rufina Pukova, in 1971. The couple remained together until Philby's death in 1988, when he finally received full honors for his work for the Soviet Union.
He was one of the greatest and remained one of the greatest because of his 100% devotion to the country.
He was given a hero's funeral and posthumously awarded numerous medals by the Soviets, including the prestigious Order of Lenin. Kim Philby has been called the worst traitor in British history, a hero of steadfast ethical convictions and an alcoholic womanizer. Regardless of what you think, it's clear that he was a deeply complex man who believed wholeheartedly in what he was doing.
There is no doubt in Washington tonight that this is an intelligence disaster.
U.S.-Russian relations were chilled early in the year when the CIA announced one of its top agents was spying for the Soviet Union and then Russia.
In February 1994, an American CIA counterintelligence agent was arrested after spying for the USA's greatest rival, the Soviet Union. The betrayal went on for years and is now considered to be one of the worst disasters in the history of the CIA. The agent's actions led to death and pain for many loyal to America.
Rick was the worst kind of traitor, and I always said, you know, he could have worked for the KGB and given them pages and pages and pages of information that wouldn't have cost somebody their life.
This is the story of Rick Ames, a tale of greed, lies, and betrayal. It's also the story of the people that caught him, ending an almost decade-long Soviet infiltration of the CIA.
He really didn't think he had anything to worry about, that we would never, ever pinpoint him. But he was wrong.
During the Cold War, international espionage was a fact of life. The Soviets and the Americans had been spying on each other since being allies in the Second World War, and the practice has continued throughout the communist era into recent years. During the Cold War, information was key to understanding and outwitting one's enemy. It was vital to know what your opponent was up to. Without access to modern-day surveillance technology, both nations relied on secret agents to gather valuable intelligence. Both the Soviets and Americans had agents feeding them information from within their enemies' governments. As well as traditional intelligence agents, both countries utilized double agents, spies who were secretly working with the nation they were meant to be spying on. The system of mutual espionage between the world's two great superpowers had existed since the 40s, but in 1985, something happened that had never happened before. Many of America's most valuable assets were being uncovered and arrested.
In 1985, we began to lose cases, by which I mean Soviet officials working for us, and some of them disappeared. This led us to believe that something was wrong.
Agents who had been feeding the CIA information for decades were suddenly being captured. Over 30 American spies were compromised during this time, including those who had retired years before.
Polyakov had retired after 18 years of spying when the KGB pounced.
Dmitry Polyakov, one of the highest-ranking Soviet officials working for the USA, was arrested in 1986.
Polyakov was our crown jewel. He worked for us for so many years, and he achieved such a rank that rather than us looking at an organization through the eyes of one of our sources, looking at that organization from the bottom up.
Another huge loss was Adolf Tolkachev, who had been known as the billion-dollar spy. Considered to be one of the most successful U.S. assets throughout the entirety of the Cold War, Tolkachev had turned on his nation after witnessing the cruelty carried out by the Soviet government. He was arrested in 1985. Both men were later executed by the Soviets. It was clear to the CIA something was terribly wrong. After numerous theories were considered, they decided that there was a mole working within their organization. A small team was assembled to find the traitor, led by experienced CIA officer Jean Vertefray.
Trying to pin down a counterintelligence case when you're looking for a mole is always a very difficult and long-term job. When we compiled a list of how many people could have done it, we came up with 198 people.
Another member of the team was Sandy Grimes, who helped turn the list of almost 200 names into just a handful.
And those are people with access. They are not suspects.
And then it didn't take me too long to eliminate most of them.
The team began to question the last few potential moles, narrowing down their search with interrogation techniques and polygraph tests. One particular question they asked singled out a key suspect.
And Jean is a genius. She was the one who devised the question, and this one in particular was marvelous.
If you were going to volunteer to the Soviet government, how would you go about it?
Each potential mole that was interviewed gave a detailed account of how they would betray the USA, including specific examples and contacts they could theoretically use. However, one agent answered very differently, becoming flustered and avoiding specific examples. His name was Rick Ames.
Now, Rick Ames is generally very articulate.
He loved the what-if questions his whole career. Well, we asked him the questions, and he was just taken back. And his reaction was so opposite what we would have expected from Rick, knowing he loved the back and forth.
Ames began working for the CIA while still in high school. After dropping out of college, he started working at the CIA full-time. Ames originally hadn't planned on building a career in intelligence, but after receiving good performance appraisals, he decided to stick it out.
Rick was very pleasant, bright, a little arrogant.
He also met his wife and fellow CIA officer Nancy Sedgbarth early in his career and the couple got married in 1969. In 1981, Ames was stationed in Mexico City, while Nancy remained in New York. His work in Mexico was mediocre, and he began to engage in several extramarital affairs. In 1982, he began an affair with Maria del Rosario Casas de Puy, a Colombian diplomat and CIA informant. As well as his poor work affairs in Mexico, Ames was also a heavy drinker, finding himself in trouble after causing an altercation with a Cuban official while drunk. Despite his failings, Ames was transferred back to Washington in 1983. His new role was with the Department of Operations, working on Soviet counterintelligence. This gave Ames access to all CIA plans and operations active in the Soviet Union. He divorced Nancy the same year, marrying Rosario in 1985. However, it was around this time that Ames realized he had a problem. His divorce had proven expensive, but not as expensive as his new marriage.
And his wife, Rosario, she came from a very wealthy Colombian family. They were not wealthy any longer when Rick married her, but her grandfather had been wealthy. So Rosario thought she was entitled to a certain lifestyle that Rick's income could not meet.
Ames thought that his divorce from Nancy might end up bankrupting him, but miraculously, his financial situation somehow began to improve around this time. It was ultimately this fact that led Grimes and her team to investigate Ames's activities further.
The FBI staked out Ames's house and tapped his phones. The breakthrough had come from CIA analysis of his bank statements.
The CIA noticed that Ames and Rosario's lifestyle did not match their income. The couple lived a luxury lifestyle. Ames drove a luxury Jaguar, wore designer suits, and spent thousands renovating his home.
He not only had fixed his teeth, he was not only wearing $600 Italian loafers and beautiful suits, but there was just a self-confidence and an arrogance and a coldness.
Meanwhile, his wife racked up massive credit card payments that exceeded Ames's monthly salary. It was later discovered that Rosario owned more than 500 pairs of shoes and 60 purses. It became clear that Ames was collecting an income from another source. All the team had to do now was follow the money.
Grimes's job was to construct a massive, meticulous database of all of Ames's activities. What the database revealed was that Ames made a series of cash deposits in the bank, each time just hours after meeting with a Russian official.
And my God, it was unbelievable. On 17 May, Rick had reported having had a lunch with his Soviet contact. 18 May, there's a deposit into his checking account for $9,000.
During meetings with Russian officials sanctioned by the CIA, Ames had been selling names and secrets to the KGB. For almost a year, Ames was kept under almost constant CIA surveillance. After gathering sufficient evidence, the CIA moved in. Ames and Rosario were arrested in February 1994. Ames's arrogance was ultimately his downfall. After years of feeding the Soviets information, he had come to believe he was untouchable.
We were both females, and he seriously considered us dumb broads.
To the minute he was arrested, he had no idea he was in trouble.
Ames later described what he felt on the day that everything came crashing down.
Shock, depression, instant recognition of, one's life flashes before one.
After a 3-year investigation, the CIA mole had finally been captured. It was only then that the true extent of Ames's betrayal was discovered. He admitted to have given the Soviets the names of virtually every American spy he was aware of, including Polyakov and Tolkachev.
Ames gave the KGB a list of every known human asset the CIA had in the Soviet Union. The list had 20 names on it. Within a year, 10 of those people were executed.
How much damage did Rick Ames' treason create?
He basically wiped out all the U.S. government's human source collection.
He wiped out your ability to have eyes and ears on the ground.
Exactly.
It is estimated that Ames compromised at least 100 American intelligence operations in total. Oleg Gordievsky was another double agent exposed by Ames. Unlike many others, he managed to escape the Soviet Union alive.
I was seized by the KGB in May 1985. I was put under house arrest, but I managed to escape in July, alive, well, and safe. I was lucky. The others were shot in the dungeons of some KGB prison after long months of continuous threats and interrogations.
After his arrest, both Ames and his wife were charged with spying for the Soviet Union and for Russia. He pleaded guilty in April and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole.
What I did to those men, the situation of their families and others, and the kind of shame and the kind of remorse that I feel is something that is and I think always will be intensely personal to me.
Today, Ames is 82 years old and resides in a medium security prison in Indiana. He's expressed regret for what he did, but those who saw their allies die due to his actions had little sympathy.
When the judge said, "I find you guilty and I sentence you to life without parole," I went home and slept like a baby.
As for Rosario, she received a 5-year sentence for tax evasion and conspiracy to commit espionage as part of a plea bargain by Ames. She claimed to have no knowledge of Ames's illegal activities.
I share the shock and the outrage. You don't betray your mother, you don't betray your country, you don't betray your wife, you don't betray people.
Evidence was later discovered that indicated Rosario was well aware of where Ames's money was coming from, but chose to accept and even encourage it after the money started rolling in.
She was involved to a very small level, but she knew everything he was doing. We got them on a telephone call one day where he is on his way home from CIA, and she's asking if he cleared a dead drop, got some money that the Russians owed him, and her question to him was, "Did you do it?" And he gave her a real smart aleck answer. I don't recall what he said now, but she got mad and she said, "Don't be an ass. Did you do it?"
Unlike the American spies who turned their backs on their government for political or moral reasons, Ames sold his friends' names for one reason: money.
Well, the reasons that I did what I did in April of 1985 were personal, banal, and amounted really to kind of greed and folly. Simple as that.
While accepting that his motivations for treachery were solely financial, Ames has implied he was just another spy.
That men like Polyakov gave up names. They gave up secrets. I did the same thing. For reasons that I considered sufficient to myself. I gave up the names of some of the same people who had earlier given up others. It's a nasty kind of circle.
Despite his attempts to justify his actions, the families and friends of those Ames betrayed may never forgive his treachery.
He knew full well what fate awaited them. And he did it basically for money.
To this day, Rick Ames remains one of the most effective double agents in history. The information he supplied led to the total devastation of the United States spy network in the USSR. Those who turned on the Soviet Union were largely driven by the failures of their government. The Soviet leadership prioritized communism over freedom, peace, and democracy, persecuting and murdering its own people for decades. Ames didn't have this incentive. The American people enjoyed a free and democratic society. However, it was a society driven by the pursuit of personal wealth. Was it this capitalist mindset that ultimately drove Ames to betray his country and sell the names of his friends to the enemy? Was it ultimately the failure of capitalism in the US that led to its betrayal, just like the failures of communism had done in the Soviet Union?
The worst intelligence breaches in decades.
Jerry Chun-Shing Lee was arrested after landing at JFK Airport in New York.
He knew better than anyone else the damage that his acts would cause.
In 2019, a former CIA employee was sentenced to 19 years for sending top-secret information to Chinese intelligence officials. The spy's actions caused the deaths of dozens of American assets in China and is just one of several Americans found guilty of spying for China in recent years. His actions shocked the CIA and devastated America's intelligence network in China, adding to the concerns of many in America that the communist nation is quickly becoming the most powerful country on the planet. But why did it happen? How was the spy caught? And what does this mean for the future of Chinese espionage? This is the story of Jerry Lee.
Suspect may be the key to solving a mystery that has troubled the agency for years.
Born in Hong Kong, Jerry Chun-Shing Lee grew up in Hawaii and became a naturalized U.S. citizen. He began working at the CIA in 1994, working as a case officer in a variety of locations around the world.
He was stationed in Tokyo, he was stationed in Beijing, he was involved in Chinese operations.
During his time in the CIA, Lee was entrusted with top-secret information, including information on numerous CIA operations and assets around the world.
CIA officers are entrusted with the crown jewels, and that is the names and sometimes the phone numbers and other contact information for our covert assets.
Despite his 13-year-long career at the CIA, his career ended on a sour note. He reportedly resigned in 2007 and moved to Hong Kong.
We're told he left disgruntled and that his career had plateaued.
For 3 years, Lee lived a quiet life in Hong Kong. He had seemingly abandoned his former career and life in America, but this all changed in 2010. He was contacted by 2 Chinese intelligence officers who offered to pay him to disclose U.S. national defense information. The agents reportedly told him they would take care of him for life, tempting him in with a gift of $100,000. The CIA had no idea that Lee had been contacted, but soon realized that they had a major issue on their hands.
Well, the CIA began to notice that many of its human assets, as you mentioned, human beings with families and friends and networks, started to disappear.
Beginning in 2010, the CIA began to notice that many of its assets in China were disappearing. Spies that had been feeding information to America were suddenly being imprisoned or executed by the Chinese government. The CIA began to think that they had a mole working within the organization. The realization came as no surprise to some. China is not only a key competitor of the United States, but possesses one of the largest and most secretive intelligence organizations in the world.
The Chinese are one of the most aggressive services out there when it comes to its attempts to penetrate not only the CIA, but also the FBI and other organs of our national security.
America's spies in China were risking everything to help the CIA, only to be betrayed by a former officer from the organization.
We have an obligation to protect these people who volunteered to commit treason against their country, against their group, to further the national security interests of America.
After failing to discover a mole within their ranks, the CIA began to suspect that a former employee may be the one feeding China information about American spies. Over the past decade, numerous former CIA employees have been found guilty of spying for China. Ron Hansen and Kevin Mallory were arrested in 2017 and 2018. Other former CIA employees and brothers Alexander and David Ma were also arrested in 2020, charged with selling state secrets to the Chinese government. Ron Hansen is a former Defense Intelligence Agency officer who pleaded guilty in March to attempting to deliver information regarding America's national defense to China. The 60-year-old was arrested in 2018 while preparing to board a flight to China. He was in possession of classified military information at the time. In his plea agreement, Hansen admitted that he was contacted by Chinese agents in 2014. He began meeting with them regularly to provide information that he sold between 2016 and 2018. He received a 10-year sentence for his crimes.
He sold China intelligence information for about $800,000.
Mr. Hansen was working in a contract position with the United States government in China, and in that position he had access to classified information. He also had signed non-disclosure agreements.
Another former CIA employee, Kevin Mallory, received 20 years in prison and 5 more of supervised release for conspiracy to transmit national defense information to intelligence agents in China. Attorney General John Demers said, "This case is one in an alarming trend of former U.S. intelligence officers being targeted by China and betraying their country and colleagues." Mallory had received a top-secret security clearance during his employment on various assignments throughout his career at both the CIA and DIA. According to court documents, Mallory traveled to Shanghai in 2017 to meet with Michael Yang, who advertised himself as a Chinese think tank employee, but who Mallory believed was a Chinese intelligence officer. Mallory, a fluent Chinese speaker, was given a device by Yang to facilitate future covert communications. Analysis of the device revealed that Mallory had discussed classified information with Yang that he could sell to China.
This is what espionage looks like. The man standing on the right in the yellow shirt is Kevin Mallory, who once held a top-secret security clearance while working for the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Footage from a surveillance camera at a Virginia FedEx store in April last year caught him as he prepared to hand a clerk stacks of classified documents to be scanned onto an SD card.
He was able to send at least 2 documents, which may have contained the names of American agents in China, putting their lives at immediate risk. The Ma brothers are currently awaiting trial for espionage offenses, with Alexander accused of gaining employment with the FBI to act as a mole and double agent. He claimed to be suffering with memory problems after his arrest, but was deemed to be competent in a medical assessment. He will go to trial in 2024.
These cases demonstrate the relentless efforts the Chinese government will undertake to recruit and exploit current and former members of America's intelligence community to gain access to our most sensitive secrets.
Contrary to the recruitment of double agents by the Soviet Union in the Cold War, Chinese intelligence agents appear to be using money rather than ideology as their key incentive. It's not the first time that Americans have sold out their nation for cash, with famous cases like those of Rick Ames and Robert Hanssen, showing that the Soviets achieved success using a similar tactic. The case of Jerry Lee was one of the first indications that China was targeting former agents in a potentially large-scale new recruitment campaign, leading to many further investigations and arrests. Lee was identified as a suspect back in 2012, and the CIA lured him back to the U.S. with a fake job offer. Lee flew back to the U.S. with his family in August 2012, stopping over in his home state of Hawaii. The FBI conducted a search of Lee's hotel room in Hawaii, revealing a thumb drive which had recently been wiped of certain documents, as well as an address book containing handwritten notes made by Lee that related to his work in the CIA. The notes contained a wide range of sensitive information, including some that would put many agents at risk if shared with China.
Authorities found 2 books in Lee's possession that had the names and phone numbers of assets and undercover CIA employees, locations of undercover facilities, and notes about secret operations, among other information.
Further investigations revealed that Lee had been receiving huge deposits of cash into his personal bank account in Hong Kong. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cash was sent to Lee from an unknown source between 2010 and 2013, just as the CIA were losing their assets in China.
He knowingly cozied up to intelligence officials from the People's Republic of China. He accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars, our belief is from the Chinese, by selling out not only his country, but conspiring to transmit secret national defense information.
When he arrived on mainland American territory, he was finally arrested, quickly realizing that the job he had flown out to take did not exist.
A former CIA officer is in jail this morning facing an accusation that some officials believe led to the deaths of U.S. informants in China.
Lee was interviewed 5 times in 2012 and 2013 by the CIA and FBI. While he accepted he had been contacted by Chinese agents, he denied receiving orders from them or selling state secrets. Investigators confronted Lee about the sensitive information they had found during their searches. Lee initially denied any wrongdoing, but was soon broken down by his interrogators. For security reasons, it was years before Lee was properly charged in 2018.
In cases like this that involve very sensitive secrets, the government often chooses not to present the full case in court because that would require disclosing classified information.
Jerry Lee was sentenced to 19 years after pleading guilty to conspiring with Chinese intelligence agents. The evidence against him was largely circumstantial, but was enough to force a confession. Lee's actions undoubtedly cost many American agents their freedom and their lives. He stands as an example of the new era of espionage in the constantly changing international intelligence war. You may have thought that the age of international espionage was over, that the capitalists and the communists weren't spying on each other in the 21st century, but you'd be very wrong. Intelligence is just as important today as it was 50 years ago in the never-ending struggle for global dominance. Despite the Cold War ending over 30 years ago, it seems as though the age of espionage is alive and well.
You may think that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we ever came to total annihilation. However, in 1983, one spy may have single-handedly prevented nuclear Armageddon.
And now in the process, he became one nation's traitor and another nation's hero.
Oleg Gordievsky joined the KGB in the early 60s, quickly rising up the ranks.
He rose up through the ranks of the Soviet intelligence service at almost record speed. His father was a KGB officer. He was born into the KGB.
The gifted young agent was sent to the Soviet embassy in Copenhagen in 1966 At the time, the KGB had a huge intelligence presence in the city.
Between 30 and 40% of the employees at the Soviet embassy in Copenhagen would actually be intelligence officers.
The Danish kept a close eye on Soviet citizens in Copenhagen, and it wasn't long before they noticed Gordievsky.
And we rather quickly found good reasons to believe that he was KGB.
Gordievsky continued his work as a Soviet spy, but things soon began to change. In 1968, he was outraged by the Soviet Union's brutal crushing of the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. More importantly, though, while living in Denmark, Gordievsky had fallen in love with Western freedom.
He met a country that was completely different from what he had been told. It's a free country. People can do what they want.
Knowing he was likely being monitored by the Danish, he started to send covert signals indicating that he wanted to defect. After tapping Oleg's phone, the Danish Secret Service overheard him talking to his wife about the Soviet Union's crimes, and it became clear that Oleg represented a real opportunity for the West.
That was the day where we said, this man may be willing to switch sides and work with us.
The Danish asked the British for help, and in 1974, MI6 approached Gordievsky at a badminton hall in Copenhagen.
The rendezvous at the badminton hall was a huge gamble for everyone. The British couldn't be sure Gordievsky wasn't a double agent, positioned by the KGB to infiltrate them. And for his part, Gordievsky couldn't be sure that the meet wasn't a trap set by the KGB to test his loyalty.
But the risk paid off. MI6 successfully recruited Gordievsky as a double agent. Refusing any money for his work, Gordievsky agreed to sell Soviet secrets to the West.
He's doing this for ideological reasons. He's doing this because that's what his heart is telling him to do.
Oleg began to supply the British with the names of Soviet agents around Scandinavia. For 4 years, he risked his life to help MI6 identify agents across Europe.
He was risking death every single time he took a document out of the office. Every time he communicated with British intelligence meant that he was risking his life.
Oleg lost his value after being recalled back to Moscow for several years. Stuck in the Soviet Union, Gordievsky was no longer able to feed valuable information to the British. However, in a miraculous turn of events, Oleg was suddenly moved to London by the KGB.
He might well have been sent to anywhere. He might have gone to Sweden or to Germany, all sorts of things. But we just were lucky we got a bullseye there.
While in London, Gordievsky was able to pass the British hundreds of names and secrets.
I met my British contacts once a month. It was in Bayswater. A small flat was rented.
Throughout his time in London, Gordievsky worked with the British to ensure that he was also feeding the KGB information that they deemed to be valuable. They began to trust him more and more, as he rose up the ranks and gained access to more valuable secrets. Gordievsky gave MI6 the names of the KGB's contacts in London. The list included massive political figures such as trade union and opposition leaders.
The list of names he passed across to British intelligence clearly showed that the Russians were very, very interested in penetrating British establishment. And we know that a number of different British figures were involved in this, including someone like Michael Foot.
After being promoted once again in 1983, Gordievsky was MI6's greatest intelligence asset. His identity was kept so secret that not even the CIA or the Prime Minister were allowed to know. But Oleg's finest moment came when international tensions almost caused a nuclear catastrophe.
I knew it was a dramatic moment. I knew Moscow was nervous.
In 1983, the Soviet Union started to believe that the West was getting ready to launch a nuclear weapon.
President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were using very strong rhetoric against the Soviet Union that enhanced his paranoia.
In particular, Reagan's famous Evil Empire speech made the Soviet leadership extremely nervous.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
In reaction to inflammatory speeches by Reagan and Thatcher, the KGB ramped up their espionage efforts to see what they were planning.
One I always remember is counting how many lights were switched on in the Ministry of Defense after 10 p.m. at night. Now, there were a lot, and the reason there were a lot was not anything to do with nuclear war, it's because the cleaners were in, cleaning the offices.
During this time of heightened tension, The world almost ended when Ronald Reagan launched Able Archer 83, a military exercise designed to simulate the events of a nuclear launch targeting the USA.
They thought we were preparing for war. So we were really teetering a bit on the brink at this stage.
In response, the Soviet Union placed hundreds of nuclear weapons on heightened alert. From the KGB's base in central London, Gordievsky witnessed the ramping up of tensions. In a desperate moment, he makes a move that may have prevented a nuclear disaster. With the Soviet leadership believing they were just days away from nuclear war, Gordievsky warns MI6 about the hysteria spreading through the KGB.
I spoke about everything which I experienced. You simply don't understand the mentality of the old Russian leaders. You're playing with fire.
Gordievsky's warning to MI6 was clear. If they didn't lower tensions soon, the Soviet Union could start a war. The Secret Service passed the information to Thatcher, who in turn took it to Ronald Reagan. Thatcher managed to convince him to tone down his speeches and cool down the situation.
She managed to persuade him, absolutely on the basis of Gordievsky's intelligence, that his speeches were simply inflaming tensions with the Russians.
In an unprecedented move, Oleg had single-handedly influenced the foreign policy of both the US and UK to successfully prevent nuclear war. But Oleg's finest moment didn't last. In 1985, disaster struck when he was called back to Moscow suddenly to receive a surprise promotion. Oleg was immediately suspicious that a Soviet spy had uncovered him. In fact, in an effort to find out the identity of the UK's most valuable agent, the CIA tasked their own spy to hunt them down. In a catastrophic turn of events for Gordievsky, the CIA agent who tracked him down was none other than Rick Ames.
What the CIA couldn't know is that Ames himself was a KGB spy.
One of the most infamous Soviet spies in history, American-born Rick Ames traded hundreds of names with the KGB for cash. His information led to the arrests of dozens of Western assets, including Gordievsky.
U.S.-Russian relations were chilled early in the year when the CIA announced one of its top agents was spying for the Soviet Union and then Russia.
Knowing that refusing the KGB was impossible, Gordievsky decided to return to Moscow and hope for the best. As expected, his visit to the KGB was not to receive a promotion.
He was taken by two KGB counter-espionage people, as he described them, big hulking brutes, and he was immediately on his guard.
Gordievsky was taken to a remote location outside Moscow and interrogated by the KGB. He was drugged with a kind of truth serum and asked questions throughout the night. However, Gordievsky kept his nerve and made it through without confessing. He was sent back to Moscow and put on house arrest.
There's also a lot of surveillance on him. There's surveillance cars outside his apartment.
Gordievsky knew that he had to escape the Soviet Union and initiated one of the most daring escape plans ever carried out by British intelligence, Operation Pimlico.
I went to the appointed place at exactly 7 o'clock.
While under tight surveillance, Gordievsky gave MI6 the signal to trigger the escape plan. He went to an agreed-upon street corner holding a British supermarket carrier bag. A few moments later, a man walked past him eating a chocolate bar. Using this secret coding system, Gordievsky and MI6 had agreed that the plan was on.
It meant I would be picked up on Saturday, the same week, at 2 o'clock.
That weekend, Gordievsky shook off his cover and took a train to St. Petersburg. From there, he made his way to the agreed-upon location not far from the Finnish border.
About 30 miles before the border, I was hiding in the woods at an appointed time, which was 2 o'clock.
Gordievsky waited in the woods, but had no idea if the British were going to meet him as planned, or if they'd been captured by the KGB.
He doesn't know whether the British car's going to make it. He's worried it's all gone wrong.
After some time, a car arrived to collect him. He was smuggled in the trunk and driven towards the Finnish border. Oleg knew that if he made it out of the USSR, he would be safe. But both he and the agents helping him would have been firmly on the KGB's radar. Miraculously, the car made it through 5 Soviet checkpoints without anyone checking the trunk of the car. Gordievsky had successfully fled the USSR.
A KGB colonel under house arrest and surveillance in Moscow, and then escaping back to the West. It never happened before.
After his escape, Gordievsky settled down in a secret location in the UK. For his treachery, he was sentenced to death by the USSR and his location is top secret to this day.
He lives under complete tight security because he is still at risk. He is still under an execution order that was passed by the Russians.
Gordievsky's miraculous career and escape from the Soviet Union remains one of the most incredible stories of Cold War espionage. Not only was Gordievsky able to escape the clutches of the KGB and live to tell the tale, but he also risked his life to potentially prevent a nuclear catastrophe. Despite this, Gordievsky will always be looked down upon in Russia. To some, he's nothing more than a traitor.
Of course, he is a traitor. The main motive of Gordy to become a British spy is vanity.
Thanks for watching History 101. Be sure to subscribe for more.